In the heart of a land scarred by oppression, where the sun cast long shadows over segregated streets and whispers of freedom were silenced by the crack of police batons, a boy was born who would one day shake the very foundations of injustice. His name was Rolilala, meaning troublemaker, a name that would echo through history not as a curse but as a prophecy. This boy would grow to face a government fortified by walls of hate, laws etched in cruelty, and leaders who believed their power was eternal. But history has always had a peculiar way of humbling those who think they can chain the human spirit. From the rolling hills of the Transkei to the cold, unforgiving walls of a prison cell on Robben Island, Rolilala Mandela's journey was carved not in comfort but in struggle. His uprising wasn't born from a single moment of defiance. No, it was a slow, burning flame, kindled in the quiet corners of rural villages, fanned by the winds of injustice in the bustling streets of Johannesburg, and finally ignited into an unstoppable blaze that swept across South Africa, consuming the very heart of apartheid. But Mandela's story isn't just about politics, prison bars, or presidential power. It's about a man who learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. It's about a leader who realized that the chains on his people's hands were nothing compared to the shackles on their minds, and he was determined to break them both. Before he was the icon the world revered, he was a son, a student, a rebel, and a man who dared to dream in a country that punished dreamers. His uprising was not just against a regime but against the idea that any system, no matter how brutal, could outlast the will of a determined heart. And so, his story begins, not with victory, but with a boy, a dream, and a fire that refused to die. Long before the name Nelson Mandela echoed in courtrooms, rallies, and the pages of history books, there was Rolilala, a boy born on July 18, 1918, in the small village of Mvezo, nestled along the banks of the Mbashe River in the Transkei region of South Africa. The world he entered was one stitched together by tribal traditions, colonial shadows, and a society rigidly divided by race and class. Yet none of that mattered to the wide-eyed boy chasing cattle under the African sun, his heart unburdened by the weight of a nation's struggles, at least, not yet. His father, Gadla Henry Mefakanyiswa, was a respected chief and counselor to the Thembu king. A man of strong will and even stronger principles, Gadla was both admired and feared. It was from him that young Rolilala inherited not just his royal lineage, but also an unyielding spirit. However, fate, as it often does with those destined for greatness, intervened early. When Mandela was just 9 years old, his father died after a bitter conflict with colonial authorities, leaving the family in financial ruin. But where doors closed, others creaked open. Following his father's death, Mandela's life took an unexpected turn, one that would shape his destiny. He was adopted by Chief Jongintaba Dalindyebo, the acting regent of the Thembu people, who took him to the royal palace in Mkhekezweni. There, surrounded by the echoes of tribal councils and the wisdom of elder statesmen, Rolilala's world expanded. He listened as leaders debated justice, honor, and governance around flickering fires, their words weaving threads into the fabric of his young mind. Despite his royal upbringing, Mandela was not shielded from the harsh realities of racial inequality. Though the regal halls spoke of tradition and heritage, beyond them lay a country gripped by the tightening claws of colonialism. Black South Africans were considered subjects, not citizens, mere shadows in their own land. Mandela watched, quietly, as his people navigated a world that had been designed to keep them in chains, without ever having to lock a door. Education became his refuge and his weapon. He attended a local Methodist school where, on his first day, a teacher gave him an English name, Nelson. It was a small act, seemingly insignificant but symbolic of the colonial grip on African identity. Yet, even as the world tried to define him, Mandela's heart remained tethered to his roots, his name, and the fire lit by his father's defiance. In the dusty paths of Kunu and the royal courts of Mkhekezweni, the boy who would challenge an empire learned his first lessons, not from textbooks, but from life itself. He learned that leadership was not about titles but service, that courage often grows in silence, and that the most powerful force in the world is not fear, but the refusal to be ruled by it. Little did the world know, the boy chasing cattle under the African sky was running toward destiny. By the time Nelson Mandela stepped onto the grounds of the University College of Fort Hare in 1939, he was no longer just the boy from Kunu. Fort Hare was the crown jewel of higher education for black South Africans, a rare sanctuary where young minds could dream beyond the invisible walls of apartheid. But even here, beneath the towering trees and colonial-era buildings, the roots of oppression ran deep. Mandela arrived with ambition stitched into every step, determined to fulfill the expectations of his royal guardians and perhaps carve out a respectable future. He studied law and the humanities, walking the delicate line between tradition and the modern world, but education does more than fill the mind, it stirs the soul. It was here that Mandela's quiet curiosity evolved into something sharper, something restless. At Fort Hare he met Oliver Tambo, a brilliant student with a mind like fire, quick, bright, and impossible to ignore. Their friendship wasn't just built on shared classes, it was forged in debates that stretched into the night, about justice, freedom, and the future of South Africa. Mandela joined the Student Representative Council, and it didn't take long before he found himself entangled in his first political act, a student protest against the administration's oppressive policies. The university demanded obedience. Mandela offered defiance. When the dust settled, he was expelled. It was his first real taste of rebellion, and it felt like both failure and freedom. Ashamed to return home in disgrace, Mandela fled to Johannesburg, a city pulsing with energy, inequality, and the sharp edges of racial segregation. The gold mines boomed while black laborers toiled in the shadows, their sweat enriching a nation that denied them basic rights. The city was a collision of worlds, glittering wealth on one side, crushing poverty on the other. It was here that Mandela's political awakening truly began. Working as a clerk at a law firm, Mandela saw apartheid not as an abstract policy, but as a daily, brutal reality. He witnessed past laws, documents black South Africans were forced to carry, like invisible chains, dictating where they could live, work, or even walk. The injustice wasn't hidden, it was written into law, etched into every street, every interaction. Determined to fight with more than just words, Mandela enrolled at the University of Witwatersrand to study law. The classrooms were filled with future leaders, some destined to defend apartheid, others determined to destroy it. Mandela was one of the few black students, often isolated, yet unyielding. He met activists from across the racial and political spectrum, their conversations dripping with the urgency of change. Then came a meeting that would alter his course forever, his introduction to the African National Congress, ANC. Founded in 1912, the ANC had long been the voice of black resistance, but Mandela wasn't content with cautious protests and polite petitions. Alongside Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu, he helped create the ANC Youth League in 1944, injecting it with a new energy, radical, impatient, and unwilling to wait for freedom that would never be freely given. Mandela's transformation was complete. The boy who once chased cattle under the sun now chased justice through the streets of Johannesburg. His heart was a battlefield, torn between the traditions of his ancestors and the demands of a future that needed warriors, not princes. This was no longer just education, it was preparation. The uprising had begun, not with a roar, but with the quiet, determined steps of a man who refused to accept the world as it was. The year 1948 marked a dark turning point in South African history. The National Party seized power, and with it came the formal birth of apartheid, a system so meticulously cruel it didn't just segregate people by race, it sought to crush their spirit. Laws were passed like chains forged in legal ink, banning interracial marriages, forcing people into designated homelands, and making black South Africans foreigners in their own country. For many, apartheid was a death sentence for hope. For Nelson Mandela, it was a call to arms. No longer content with petitions and polite protests, Mandela's leadership within the ANC Youth League became bolder, sharper, and more dangerous. He helped draft the Program of Action, demanding mass mobilization, civil disobedience, and non-violent resistance. His speeches were no longer just passionate, they were electric, charged with the kind of defiance that made governments nervous. Then came the Defiance Campaign of 1952, a coordinated wave of non-violent resistance against apartheid laws. Mandela was at the forefront orchestrating acts of civil disobedience, people burning their passbooks, sitting in whites-only areas and refusing to comply with unjust laws. The government responded the only way it knew how, with violence, arrests, and intimidation. Mandela was arrested and sentenced to 9 months of hard labor, suspended for 2 years. But prison did not silence him, it amplified his message. He emerged with a reputation that transcended Johannesburg's streets. He was becoming the face of resistance. With Oliver Tambo, he opened South Africa's first black law firm, providing legal aid to those brutalized by apartheid. Day after day, Mandela faced desperate clients, families torn apart, livelihoods destroyed, dignity stolen. But even in the courtroom, justice was a foreign language. The law was not a shield for the oppressed, it was a weapon against them. Then, in 1960, everything changed. On a clear morning in Sharpeville, thousands of peaceful protesters gathered, burning their passbooks as an act of defiance. The police opened fire without warning. 69 people were killed, many shot in the back as they fled. The Sharpeville massacre wasn't just a tragedy, it was a breaking point. The facade of peaceful resistance shattered under the weight of blood-stained streets. The government responded by banning the ANC. Mandela went underground, trading his suit for disguises, factory worker, driver, gardener, whatever it took to evade capture. The man once known for legal arguments was now plotting sabotage. Mandela's philosophy had evolved. The time comes in the life of any nation when there remain only 2 choices, submit or fight. He chose to fight. In the shadows, he co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, a militant wing of the ANC. Their mission sabotaged government infrastructure to cripple the apartheid regime without taking lives. Explosions rocked power plants, government buildings, and military installations. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated strikes against the machinery of oppression. Mandela became a ghost, South Africa's most wanted man, known as the Black Pimpernel for his ability to evade capture. But ghosts cannot run forever. In 1962, after years in hiding, Mandela was captured. Betrayed by informants, he was arrested, charged with leaving the country illegally, and inciting workers to strike. But the government wasn't satisfied. They wanted to bury the symbol, not just the man. During the infamous Rivonia trial, Mandela stood before a courtroom designed to crush him. Instead, he delivered a speech that echoed far beyond its walls. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for. But my lord, if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. But they didn't realize something crucial. You can imprison a man, but you cannot imprison an idea. When the iron gates of Robben Island slammed shut behind Nelson Mandela in 1964, the apartheid regime believed they had silenced him. They thought that burying him in a tiny cold cell with stone walls and razor wire would make the world forget his name. But prison has a strange way of transforming the people it holds. For some, it breaks them. For others, it forges them into legends. Mandela's cell was no bigger than a walk-in closet, bare, with nothing but a thin mat on the floor, a small stool, and a bucket for a toilet. The window was too small to offer much light, casting long shadows that stretched across the cement floor like silent reminders of his confinement. He spent his days doing hard labor in a lime quarry where the sun's glare off the white rocks burned his eyes so badly he could never shed tears again. Not even when his own son died, while he was locked away. But Mandela didn't break. He grew stronger. The prison guards saw him as just another number, 466 64ths, prisoner number 466 of the year 1964. But within those walls, Mandela became something more, a symbol, not just for South Africa, but for oppressed people around the world. He organized secret political meetings with his fellow inmates, transforming Robben Island into an underground university. They called it the University of Robben Island, where prisoners exchanged ideas, debated strategies, and kept the flame of resistance alive. Outside those prison walls, South Africa burned. The apartheid government tightened its grip, enforcing brutal laws with police batons and bullets. But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't erase Mandela's presence. His name became a rallying cry whispered in classrooms, shouted in protests, and painted on walls from Soweto to London. As the years dragged on, the world began to watch. In the 1970s and 1980s, the anti-apartheid movement exploded across the globe. Countries imposed sanctions on South Africa. Celebrities, politicians, and activists demanded with one voice, "Free Nelson Mandela!" Yet Mandela remained behind bars, even as offers of release were placed before him. The government told him, "Renounce the armed struggle," and you can walk free. Mandela's answer was simple. Only free men can negotiate. A prisoner cannot enter into contracts. He would not bargain with his captors for crumbs of freedom. If South Africa was to be free, it had to be unconditional. Then came a shift, like the distant tremor before an earthquake. The apartheid government was crumbling under international pressure, economic sanctions, and growing civil unrest. Even within the regime, leaders began to see that they couldn't hold back the tides of change forever. In 1990, after 27 years of imprisonment, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison, his fist raised in defiance and triumph. The world held its breath as the man they had called the Black Pimpernel reappeared, not as a broken man, but as a leader more powerful than ever. His face was older, carved with the lines of struggle and sacrifice. But his spirit, unshaken. Mandela's imprisonment had done the very thing his captors feared most. It had made him immortal. On February 11, 1990, the world stood still. The gates of Victor Verster prison creaked open, and Nelson Mandela emerged. A man who had spent 27 years locked away, yet carried himself with the calm dignity of someone who had never been caged. His fist shot into the air, a simple gesture that roared louder than any speech. Crowds erupted in cheers, tears streaming down faces, as if the very ground beneath South Africa had shifted. But Mandela's journey was far from over. Freedom from prison was not the same as freedom for his people. The country he returned to was on the brink of civil war. Apartheid was crumbling, but its death throes were violent. Townships burned, political factions clashed, and rivers of blood stained the streets. The dream of a free South Africa was within reach, but so was the nightmare of total collapse. Mandela knew this fragile moment demanded more than just a revolutionary, it needed a peacemaker. Despite spending nearly 3 decades imprisoned by the apartheid regime, Mandela did the unthinkable. He sat down with his former enemies. He met with President F.W. de Klerk, the man representing the very system that had stolen his freedom. Their handshake was stiff, filled with the weight of history, but it marked the beginning of a delicate dance between hope and hatred. Mandela wasn't naive. He understood that dismantling apartheid wasn't just about changing laws, it was about healing a nation poisoned by centuries of racism. He called for calm, urging black South Africans not to seek revenge but reconciliation. But not everyone agreed. Even within the ANC, there were those who thought Mandela had grown soft in prison, too willing to compromise. Then in 1993, a bullet threatened to shatter the fragile peace. Chris Hani, a beloved anti-apartheid leader, was assassinated by a white supremacist. The country teetered on the edge of chaos. Riots erupted and civil war seemed inevitable. Mandela stepped forward, not with anger, but with resolve. His speech was simple but powerful. Tonight I am reaching out to every South African, black and white. This is a watershed moment for our country. The time for healing is now. And the nation listened. His words didn't just cool tempers, they saved lives. Mandela had become more than a leader. He was the heartbeat of a country desperate for unity. Finally, on April 27, 1994, South Africa held its first multiracial democratic elections. People who had been denied the right to vote for generations stood in lines that stretched for miles, some waiting for hours under the hot African sun. But they didn't mind. They were voting not just with ballots, but with their hearts. When the results were announced, there was no surprise. Nelson Mandela had won. But it wasn't just an election victory, it was the triumph of an idea, that freedom once born cannot be killed. At his inauguration as South Africa's first black president, Mandela stood before the world, not as a man who had conquered his enemies, but as one who had conquered hate itself. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will experience the oppression of one by another, and with that, a new chapter began. Mandela's presidency was marked by his unwavering commitment to reconciliation and nation-building. He understood that true freedom required more than the end of apartheid. It demanded the creation of a society where all South Africans could coexist peacefully and with equal opportunity. He established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to address the atrocities committed during apartheid. This commission allowed victims to share their stories and perpetrators to confess their crimes, fostering a spirit of forgiveness and healing. Mandela also focused on improving the living conditions of black South Africans, investing in housing, education, and healthcare. His policies aimed at redressing the economic imbalances created by decades of racial discrimination. Despite facing numerous challenges, Mandela's leadership inspired hope and unity. He was a global icon, receiving accolades and honors from around the world. Yet, he remained humble, often saying, "I am not a saint, unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying." Mandela stepped down after one term, believing in the importance of democratic principles and the peaceful transfer of power. His retirement from politics did not end his influence. He continued to advocate for peace, justice, and human rights until his passing in 2013. Nelson Mandela's legacy endures not just in South Africa but globally. He taught us that forgiveness is stronger than hatred, that perseverance can overcome the greatest obstacles, and that one person's courage can change the world. His life remains a testament to the power of the human spirit and the enduring quest for freedom and equality. When Nelson Mandela took the presidential oath on May 10, 1994, the sun rose not just over Pretoria, but over the soul of a nation reborn. His inauguration wasn't just a ceremony, it was a victory march for freedom. Sitting in the front row were his former prison guards, while military jets, once symbols of apartheid's oppression, flew overhead in honor of the man they had tried to silence. But Mandela knew the hard part wasn't over. Winning the fight for freedom was one thing. Building a nation from the ashes of hatred was another. South Africa was broken, its people divided by race, fear, and generations of injustice. Many expected Mandela to rule with vengeance, to dismantle the remnants of apartheid with the same brutality it had inflicted. But Mandela's greatest power wasn't his ability to fight, it was his capacity to forgive. His first mission as president wasn't about politics, it was about healing. One of his most brilliant moves came through something unexpected: rugby. The sport had long been a symbol of white Afrikaner pride, while black South Africans viewed it as a reminder of oppression. But Mandela saw beyond that. During the 1995 Rugby World Cup, hosted in South Africa, Mandela donned the green jersey of the national team, the Springboks, and stood alongside their white captain, Francois Pienaar. The stadium, filled with mostly white fans, erupted, not in boos, but in cheers. "Nelson! Nelson! Nelson!" they chanted. It was more than just a game. It was a masterstroke of unity. The image of Mandela in that jersey became a symbol of reconciliation, a lesson that the past could be acknowledged without being chained to it. But Mandela wasn't just a figurehead. He tackled the country's deep-rooted problems: poverty, inequality, and a fractured economy. Under his leadership, South Africa created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Instead of revenge, the commission sought the truth. Victims of apartheid shared their stories, perpetrators confessed their crimes. It wasn't perfect, and it couldn't erase the pain, but it gave the nation something priceless: the chance to face its demons openly. Yet, Mandela was never obsessed with power. Unlike many leaders who cling to office, he served only one term as president. In 1999, he stepped down willingly, proving that true leadership isn't about holding on, it's about knowing when to let go. In his retirement, Mandela didn't fade into the background. He became a global icon for peace, advocating for human rights, HIV/AIDS awareness, and social justice worldwide. World leaders sought his wisdom, celebrities admired him. But through it all, Mandela remained grounded, often referring to himself as just an ordinary man who had done extraordinary things because circumstances demanded it. On December 5, 2013, Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. The world mourned, not just South Africa. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. But Mandela's legacy wasn't written in monuments or statues. It was written in the hearts of people who believed, because of him, that even the deepest wounds can heal. His life was proof that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the triumph over it. That forgiveness is the ultimate act of strength, and that one man's dream can set an entire nation free. Nelson Mandela's story didn't end with his passing in 2013. It continues to echo in the streets of Johannesburg, in the classrooms of Soweto, and in the hearts of millions across the globe. His legacy is not carved in stone or confined to history books. It lives on in the idea that one person's courage can ripple through generations. Mandela wasn't a flawless hero. He was a man who made mistakes, wrestled with anger, and faced crushing despair. But what set him apart was his ability to rise above bitterness, to look his oppressors in the eye and choose reconciliation over revenge. He showed the world that forgiveness is not a weakness, it's a revolutionary act. His name became synonymous with freedom, but it's not just the freedom to vote or speak, it's the freedom to dream, to heal, and to believe that change is possible, no matter how impossible it seems. His life proved that resilience can outlast oppression. Hope can survive even behind prison walls, and leadership is not about power, but about service. Today his legacy is stitched into the very fabric of South Africa's democracy, reflected in every child who learns about equality, in every leader who chooses dialogue over conflict, and in every person who dares to stand up against injustice. Nelson Mandela taught us that history is not written by those who conquer others, but by those who conquer themselves. And perhaps the greatest lesson he left behind is this: it always seems impossible until it's done. His journey from a village boy in Kunu to a global symbol of peace reminds us all, the fight for justice is never easy, but it's always worth it.